Fear curled in her stomach. Her first instinct was to run to her mother. But then she imagined what would happen if she did. If someone was really hiding there, they would hear her. They would know she had discovered them. And if they were dangerous, she and her mother could be the first victims. She swallowed hard, forcing her feet to keep moving, forcing her face to remain calm as if nothing was wrong. She carried the tray into the dining room and set it down carefully, her eyes darting toward the large glass window where the reflection of the hallway was faintly visible. And she thought she saw a shadow slip quickly out of sight. Her mother came in behind her, humming softly as she placed a dish on the table. The girl wanted to speak, to whisper what she had seen. But the words stuck in her throat. Because she knew her mother would panic, and panic would be dangerous, she glanced at the billionaire, who had just walked in, his calm, powerful figure filling the room. And she wondered if he too could sense the strangeness in the air. She wished she could tell him everything. But she was only a servant's daughter, just a child in his enormous world, and her voice might not even be taken seriously. She stood in the corner, pretending to wipe her hands on her apron, her eyes scanning every doorway, every reflection, her heart beating so loudly she was afraid someone else would hear it. Then she remembered something her teacher once said at school, that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act in spite of it. And she knew in that moment that she had to do something. She could not let her silence place this man in danger, because the whispers, the shoes, the shadows, they all pointed to one truth. Someone was waiting for him, and it was not for good. Her fingers itched to write, to warn, to somehow tell him without alerting the others. But she had nothing with her, no notebook, no paper. Then her eyes fell on the folded napkins prepared neatly at each seat of the dining table. Fine linen, crisp and white. She realized she could slip a message inside, small enough to pass unnoticed, quick enough to reach him before danger struck. Her hands trembled at the thought. She had never done anything so bold in her life, but she also knew that if she stayed silent, she might wake tomorrow to hear news of tragedy, and she could never forgive herself. Quietly, she slipped back into the kitchen, pretending to fetch a glass of water. Her mother, busy with food, did not notice. She snatched a small piece of paper from the corner of the grocery list pad and tore it quickly. She grabbed a pen, her hand shaking, and wrote the only words that her mind could put together in such fear. Short words, urgent words, words that might make the difference. Don't panic. It's a trap. The letters uneven, hurried, but clear enough to be understood. She folded the paper into the smallest square possible and slipped it into her apron pocket. Her palms sweaty, her breath shallow. Returning to the dining room, she walked slowly, praying no one would see her. She moved toward the table, her mother instructing her to set the napkins properly. And it was then that she slid the folded note into the one placed for the billionaire, pressing it deep between the folds so it would not fall out too early. Her heart raced so wildly that her knees almost gave way, but she forced herself to keep her movements natural, arranging the rest of the napkins as if nothing unusual had happened. She stepped back into the shadows, her eyes glued to the billionaire as he sat down, wondering if he would notice, if he would even read it before it was too late. Every second felt like an eternity, her chest tight, her mind screaming for him to see the warning. Yet she dared not move closer or show her fear, because she knew someone else was in the house, someone waiting, someone who would be watching for any sign of suspicion, and if they guessed what she had done, it would all be over, before help could come. In that moment, she was no longer just a servant's daughter. She was the silent guardian of a man who had no idea that danger was already breathing within the walls of his mansion. And as the candles flickered on the dining table, she stood frozen, praying that the note hidden in the folds of white linen would reach his hands in time, praying that he would understand, praying that he would live to see another dawn. The maid's daughter stood near the doorway, her hands pressed tightly together, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She could not believe what she had just done. The folded scrap of paper, so small and fragile, now rested inside the billionaire's napkin, hidden among the folds of white linen. A secret message that could either save him or cost her everything if someone else discovered it. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to appear calm, though inside her fear grew heavier with each passing second. The billionaire entered the dining room with slow, steady steps, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp, the kind of eyes that notice details without making it obvious. He pulled the chair back and sat down, his movements smooth as if this were just another evening in his life of luxury. The maid placed a dish in front of him. Smiling politely, her daughter stood behind her, pretending to be still, yet her entire body trembled with nervous energy. Her gaze fixed on the napkin he was about to unfold. The candles on the table flickered gently, their flames bending with the faint movement of air. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching tall and thin, and for a moment everything seemed calm, almost too calm. The girl's breath caught in her throat as the billionaire reached for the napkin. He lifted it slowly, the soft fabric unfolding in his hands, and then it happened. The small square of paper slipped out, falling silently onto the polished wooden table. A flash of white against the dark surface. For a second, he froze, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then he picked it up, curious, his fingers unfolding the crumpled paper carefully. The writing inside was small and rushed, the ink slightly smudged, but the words were clear enough. Don't panic. It's a trap. He read them twice, his mind processing the message with sharp speed, his expression unchanged so that no one watching could guess what he had seen. But inside, a storm of questions rose instantly. Who wrote this? What kind of trap? And why tonight? He glanced up subtly, his eyes sweeping the room without moving his head much. The maid was busy arranging dishes, unaware. The girl stood stiff and pale in the corner, her wide eyes fixed on him. And in that silent exchange he understood, it was her. The maid's daughter had given him this warning. She was too young to invent such a lie, too nervous to create drama for no reason. The urgency in her eyes matched the urgency in the note, and he knew at once this was not a prank. It was real. He folded the note quickly, sliding it under his plate as if it were nothing more than a scrap of tissue, his face calm, his hands steady. He did not allow a single flicker of fear to show, because if someone was indeed inside the house waiting, the last thing he could do was reveal that he had been warned. He lifted his fork and began to eat slowly, his posture relaxed, his voice casual as he asked the maid a simple question about the food, as if everything was perfectly normal, but his mind was racing with every possible scenario. The girl watched him, her chest rising and falling fast. She had done her part. Now it was in his hands. She prayed he believed her, prayed he understood, and when she saw the way he kept his expression calm, the way his eyes shifted slightly toward the reflections in the glass doors, she knew he had received her message. He had not ignored it. He was preparing himself, and that gave her a small measure of relief, though the fear in her stomach remained sharp. The billionaire's senses sharpened. Every sound in the room seemed louder, the clink of silverware, the faint creak of the wooden floor, the whisper of wind outside. He leaned back in his chair slightly, his eyes catching the reflection of the hallway in the glass cabinet. He thought he saw movement, a quick shadow slipping by. His muscles tightened but his face remained calm. He had been in dangerous negotiations before, had faced men who wanted his empire. But this was different. This was not about money or contracts. This was about survival, and survival required silence, patience, and the ability to act at the right moment. He lowered his hand casually to his lap, sliding his phone out without attracting attention. His thumb moving swiftly, he typed a silent message to his head of security. A simple signal they had agreed upon years ago. It meant danger, immediate response, no questions asked. He placed the phone back as quietly as he had taken it, continuing to eat, chewing slowly, his gaze never leaving the food though his mind was fully alert to everything else around him. The maid cleared a plate, humming softly, unaware of the tension filling the air. Her daughter stood rigid, afraid that at any second someone might burst from the shadows, afraid that her note might have been discovered by the wrong person, afraid that maybe it would all be too late. But the billionaire gave nothing away. His calmness was his armor. His silence was his shield. He acted as though the evening were no different from any other. But in his heart he silently thanked the girl for her courage, for her warning, for giving him the chance to prepare. Minutes passed like hours. The house seemed to breathe around them, every shadow a threat, every silence a warning. The girl's hands trembled but she kept them hidden behind her back. The billionaire continued his meal, his mind sharp, waiting, watching, and all the while the little folded paper sat hidden beneath his plate, carrying only 6 words. 6 words that turned an ordinary dinner into a fight for survival. 6 words written by a frightened girl who had chosen bravery over silence. And, in that choice, she had changed the course of the night. The billionaire sat at the long dining table, the silver cutlery shining under the chandelier, his plate half full, his glass untouched. But his mind was no longer on the food. It was on the crumpled piece of paper hidden beneath his plate. The words written in haste still burned in his thoughts. Don't panic. It's a trap. 6 short words that changed the entire mood of the evening. 6 words that turned his peaceful dinner into a battlefield he could not yet see. He leaned back slowly, chewing with deliberate calm, his eyes moving in subtle glances. He was a man trained by years of business battles to read people, to sense tension, to know when someone was lying, and the weight of the girl's warning grew heavier the more he thought about it. He had no reason to doubt her, no reason to think a child would invent such a dangerous claim, and so he decided in that instant to trust her. His life might depend on it. The maid bustled about the table, humming gently, moving plates and adjusting the dishes. She noticed nothing unusual. Her daughter stood nearby, pale and silent, her eyes fixed on the billionaire, waiting for the smallest sign that he had understood, waiting for proof that he believed her. And when she saw his hand rest calmly on the edge of the table, his face as steady as stone, she realized he had indeed seen the note. He had not ignored her. He had accepted the truth. The billionaire's heart beat hard in his chest, though his outward calm never broke. He had built his empire on 2 things, control and timing, and both were now his only weapons. If he lost control even for a second, whoever was hiding in his house would sense it. And if he made a move too early, he might spring the trap before he had a chance to escape it. So he sat quietly, eating slowly, pretending to be unaware, all the while listening, watching, and waiting. He placed his fork down and wiped his mouth with the napkin, his fingers brushing the folded linen as if nothing were inside. Yet he knew that a frightened girl had just saved him from walking blindly into danger. He wondered what kind of trap had been set. Was it robbery, kidnapping, something more personal? He had made enemies in business, enemies who wanted him ruined, and some perhaps who wanted him dead. He could not know which one of them had come knocking tonight, but he knew they were here. A faint sound reached his ears, softer than the hum of the chandelier, the creak of a floorboard far down the hallway. It was the kind of sound made by weight, by someone trying to move quietly. His body tensed but his expression never changed. He reached for his glass, sipping water slowly, his eyes catching the faint reflection of movement in the glass doors that opened to the hallway. There was no doubt anymore, someone else was inside his house. The girl shifted nervously, her small fingers twisting in front of her apron. She wanted to scream, to shout, to warn her mother, but fear sealed her lips. Instead her wide eyes remained fixed on him, silently begging him to believe her, to act, and he gave her nothing but calm silence, a calmness that was meant to protect her, to keep the enemy unaware that he already knew. For if panic spread through the house too soon, the intruders might strike quickly, and there would be no time for help to arrive. The billionaire's mind moved with speed, calculating each detail, the distance to the front door, the time it would take his security team to arrive after the message he had sent, the possible exits the intruders could use. He thought of the staff, the maid, her daughter, innocent lives that could be taken if things turned violent, and he felt a cold determination settle inside him. This was no longer about wealth or pride. This was about survival, about protecting those who had unknowingly been caught in the same trap. Another sound came, this one sharper, the click of metal against wood, maybe a weapon being shifted, maybe the accidental scrape of a shoe. His ears caught it. His eyes remained calm. He cut another piece of food as if nothing at all was wrong. But in his heart he knew the danger was closer now, seconds, maybe minutes away. The quiet before the storm was nearly over. The girl held her breath, her chest heavy. She could not stop trembling. Her mind screamed that at any moment masked men would burst into the room. Yet she forced herself to stay still, because she knew one wrong move could bring disaster. Her note had done its job. She had delivered the warning. Now it was the billionaire's turn. She prayed silently that he would know what to do, prayed that he would survive the trap that had been set for him. The billionaire raised his eyes slightly, meeting the girl's gaze for just 1 second. It was not a long look, but in that glance he gave her silent thanks. He wanted her to know he understood, that he was prepared, that her courage had not been wasted. Then he looked away, his calm mask slipping perfectly back into place, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But inside, his heart beat with steady fire. He was ready for what was coming. The dining room seemed colder, the air thicker, as though the house itself held its breath, waiting, listening, preparing, and in that heavy silence the billionaire realized just how close he had come to danger. Without the note he would have sat at this table with no suspicion, unaware until the intruders revealed themselves. And by then it might have been too late. The girl's warning had given him a precious weapon, knowledge, and with knowledge came the power to survive. He took another sip of water, his hand steady, his face calm, but his eyes sharp, watching the shadows that danced in the hallway. He knew the trap would spring soon. He knew the night was far from over, and though the danger was still hidden, he was ready, for the discovery of that small folded note had changed everything, and now, instead of walking blindly into the jaws of death, he would face the danger with eyes wide open. The billionaire sat at the table, the taste of food no longer reaching him, the glass of water cool against his lips but doing nothing to ease the dryness in his throat. Inside he was alert, sharp, his mind working like a machine, but on the outside he appeared calm, relaxed, almost bored. He had learned long ago that in dangerous situations showing fear could be deadly, and now more than ever he needed to act as though nothing was wrong. He needed to pretend he had no idea that a trap had been set for him. He picked up his fork again, cutting a piece of food with slow, steady movements. He chewed thoughtfully, his eyes focused on his plate. But in truth he was listening more than he was eating. Every sound in the house reached his ears. The faint creak of wood, the soft rustle of fabric, even the silence itself pressed against him, heavy and unnatural. He had lived in this mansion long enough to know its every sound, and tonight the house spoke differently. Tonight the silence carried hidden footsteps. The maid's daughter still stood in the corner, her hands folded tightly together, her eyes fixed on him with silent desperation. She wanted to run to him, to explain more, but she knew she could not. She had already taken the risk of slipping him the note, and if anyone had seen her do it, she and her mother might already be in danger. She prayed he had understood, prayed he would act with the strength and wisdom people said he always carried, and when she saw the calm way he ate his meal, she realized he was not panicking. He was pretending. The billionaire asked the maid about the seasoning in the food, his voice casual, smooth, as though this were nothing more than another ordinary evening. The maid smiled, pleased that he noticed. She explained softly that her daughter had helped prepare the vegetables. The girl's face flushed with embarrassment, her eyes lowering quickly, but behind her shyness was the weight of fear. She could barely stand still, her heart racing so fast she thought she might faint, but she kept her silence. Because the billionaire's calm was guiding her, it told her to hold on, to wait. He leaned back in his chair, pretending to be tired from his long day, his eyes half closed, but his mind was scanning every corner of the room. He knew from experience that when a trap was set, those behind it were watching closely, waiting for the right moment to strike, and he could not give them that moment too soon. He had to convince them that he was unaware, that he was defenseless, that their plan was still secret, and only then could he control the outcome. Quietly, he shifted his hand under the table, his phone resting in his lap. Earlier he had already sent a quick signal to his security team. But now he typed one more short message, a wordless alert with his location. He pressed send and slipped the phone back, his movements so smooth that even the maid who stood close by did not notice. His years of practice in hiding his true thoughts in business meetings now served him in this darker, more dangerous setting. It was a game of masks, and he had worn one all his life. From the hallway, another faint sound came, the soft scrape of a shoe against the floor, then silence again. The billionaire lifted his glass calmly, taking a slow sip, his heartbeat steadying with effort. He would not allow fear to control him. He would control the fear instead. He let his gaze drift across the polished surface of the glass table, where reflections gave him glimpses of shadows in the corridor. He did not turn his head, he did not react, but he knew for certain now that someone was waiting, just beyond the doorway, someone who believed he was still blind. The maid cleared one of the plates and disappeared into the kitchen for a moment. The daughter followed to help, leaving the billionaire briefly alone in the dining room. Though he was never truly alone, he could feel the eyes watching him from the unseen corners. He could sense the danger thick in the air. He cut another piece of food, chewing slowly, his face calm as stone, his movement steady. He wanted them to keep waiting, to believe he was still unaware, because every second that passed brought his security closer to the house. The girl returned with her mother, carrying a tray of fruit, her eyes flicking quickly toward him, searching for a sign, and though he gave none, the calmness in his posture was enough. It told her he was strong. It told her that he understood, and that gave her courage, though her small hands still shook as she placed the tray on the table, pretending to be normal while her heart screamed that intruders were hiding just steps away. The billionaire took a piece of fruit, biting into it as though nothing were wrong, his eyes relaxed, his shoulders loose. He even allowed himself a small smile when the maid asked if he would like coffee after dinner. His voice smooth as he agreed. his tone so normal that anyone listening from the shadows might have believed this was an ordinary evening. But under that mask of ease burned a fire of readiness. He was waiting for the moment the trap would be revealed. And when it came, he would not be caught unprepared. The minutes stretched long, the air in the mansion heavy with silence, the girl's heart racing faster with each tick of the clock. But the billionaire remained steady, his disguise perfect, his every gesture convincing. He knew the enemy was watching, and so he played his role to perfection. A man tired from his day, a man relaxed in his home, a man unaware that danger crept in the shadows of his own walls, but in truth he was the opposite. His senses alive, his mind sharp, and his strength ready, for he was no stranger to battles, and tonight would be no different. The billionaire sat quietly at the dining table, his fork resting against the edge of the plate, his calm mask never slipping, though inside he was prepared for what he knew was coming. The warning in the note had given him the truth, and the faint sounds around the mansion had confirmed it. He was not alone. Someone was waiting, someone was hiding, and soon they would reveal themselves. The maid carried away the last dish, humming softly, unaware of the danger that filled the air. Her daughter stayed close, her eyes fixed on the billionaire, waiting for the storm to break, her small chest rising and falling quickly as if she could hardly breathe. And still she said nothing, because the silence had to be maintained. Panic would destroy them all. Panic would tell the intruders that their secret was discovered. Then it happened. The trap that had been waiting in the shadows finally began to unfold. From the hallway came the sudden sound of heavy footsteps, fast and confident, no longer trying to be silent, no longer hiding. The air seemed to grow colder as three masked men stepped into the dining room, their faces covered, their bodies tense, each of them carrying weapons that glinted in the soft candlelight. They moved quickly, spreading out around the table, their voices sharp and filled with threat. They shouted at the billionaire to stay seated, to keep quiet, to do as they said. The maid gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, the tray of cups she carried falling to the floor, shattering loudly. The girl froze beside her, fear gripping her like ice, her wide eyes fixed on the masked figures. She wanted to run but her legs refused to move. She clutched at her mother's arm, her entire body shaking, yet the billionaire remained still, calm as if the entire scene were expected, his steady voice breaking the tension as he asked them what they wanted. The leader of the intruders stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. He demanded access to the billionaire's safe. He demanded valuables, jewels, cash, and everything else the house contained. He thought this would be easy. He thought the man seated before him would panic, would beg, would obey. But the billionaire's composure unsettled him. It made him hesitate. Because the man who sat at the table looked less like a victim and more like someone waiting for the right moment to strike back. The girl held tightly to her mother, her heart racing. She realized with horror that these were the people her note had warned about. These were the men she had heard whispering in the hallway. The owners of those strange shoes. They were real. They were here. And if the billionaire had not discovered her note in time, he might have been taken by surprise, trapped and helpless. But now, as she looked at him, she saw no fear in his eyes, only control, only readiness. The billionaire raised his hands slowly, pretending to comply, his voice calm as he told them he would give them what they wanted. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He stood up with dignity, as though he was still in control of his own house. The men pushed him toward the hallway, shouting orders. But before they could go further, the sound of pounding footsteps echoed through the entrance hall, strong and fast. And suddenly the mansion's front doors burst open. His private security team rushed in, dressed in black, their movements precise, their voices commanding. The room exploded into chaos as orders were shouted, weapons raised, and the intruders, caught off guard, scrambled to react. The billionaire stepped back smoothly, moving behind the nearest guard, his calm mask still unbroken even as the trap turned against those who had set it. The maid screamed and pulled her daughter into the corner, shielding her with her arms, her eyes wide with terror. As the two groups clashed in the dining room, the masked men tried to fight, one swinging his weapon wildly, another attempting to flee through the hallway. But the security team was faster, stronger, and trained. They cornered the intruders with swift precision, forcing them down, pinning their arms, shouting for them to surrender. The sound of struggle filled the house, chairs crashing, glass shattering, until finally the fight ended, and the masked men lay subdued on the polished floor, their weapons kicked away, their hands tied behind their backs. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the maid and her daughter. The girl trembling so violently that she could barely stand. She clung to her mother's dress, her eyes wide with disbelief at what she had just witnessed. The danger was real. The trap had almost succeeded, but because of her note, because of her courage, the billionaire had been ready, and his team had arrived in time to save them all. The billionaire straightened his suit, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve, his calm expression never leaving. Though inside he felt a deep surge of relief. He had faced danger many times in his life, but rarely so close to home, rarely so personal. He turned his gaze toward the girl in the corner, her small body trembling, her face pale, and in that moment he knew, without her warning, without her bravery, this night might have ended very differently. The intruders were dragged out of the mansion, their shouts fading into the distance as police cars arrived outside, red and blue lights flashing against the walls of the house. The security guards reporting quickly, their voices clipped and professional. The danger was over, the house safe again. Yet the echo of fear still lingered in the air, still lived in the hearts of the maid and her daughter, who had seen just how close death had come to their home. The billionaire walked toward them slowly, his footsteps calm, steady, his face softer now as he looked at the girl. She could not meet his eyes at first. She felt too small, too unimportant. Yet he bent slightly so that his gaze reached hers. And though he said nothing, the warmth in his eyes told her everything. He knew the truth. He knew what she had done. He knew she had saved his life. The house slowly returned to silence, but it was not the same silence as before. This was the silence after a storm, heavy with relief, heavy with unspoken gratitude. And as the girl clung to her mother's arm, she finally allowed herself to breathe again, her heart still racing but her spirit stronger than before, for she had faced fear, she had acted, and though the trap had unfolded as planned, it had been broken by the courage of a single frightened child. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cars painted the walls of the mansion with uneasy colors. The sound of radios crackling and officers shouting orders echoed through the entrance hall. The intruders were dragged out one by one, their masks pulled away, their hands bound tightly, their faces pale with the shock of failure. What they thought would be an easy victory had turned into a humiliating defeat. Their trap had collapsed before it could truly begin. The billionaire stood quietly near the dining table, his tall figure calm, his sharp eyes following the scene. He did not shout, he did not rage, he simply observed with the cold authority of a man used to power. Yet deep inside him, beneath the calm surface, was the weight of something else, a rare feeling he did not often show, relief. For he knew how close danger had come. He knew how narrow the line between life and death had been. And he knew that without one small act of courage from a young girl, the outcome could have been very different. The maid stood trembling in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around her daughter, her face pale, her lips whispering prayers of thanks that neither of them had been hurt. She had served the billionaire's household for years. She had cleaned these floors, prepared these meals, lived in the quiet shadows of his grand life. But tonight everything had changed. Tonight her own daughter had stepped into a story much larger than any of them could have imagined, and the mother's heart swelled with both pride and fear. The billionaire finally walked toward them, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble, his expression no longer as hard as before, his eyes softer, more human. He stopped in front of them, looking first at the maid and then at her daughter. The silence heavy as though the whole mansion waited for his words. The girl dared not meet his gaze. Her small hands twisted nervously in her mother's dress, her heart beating so fast she thought it would burst. She wondered if she had done the right thing, if she had angered him by interfering. But then he spoke. He said only a few words, but they carried more weight than an entire speech. His voice calm and steady as he thanked her. He told her that she had saved his life, that her warning had given him the chance to act before the trap could close on him. His eyes did not blink as he looked at her, serious but warm, letting her know that he understood, that he believed her, and that he would never forget what she had done. The maid's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her daughter closer, her voice trembling as she apologized for any trouble. But the billionaire shook his head, silencing her with a small gesture. There was no trouble, he said, only gratitude, the kind of gratitude that could never truly be repaid. For no amount of money, no guards, no locks could have saved him tonight. Only a child's courage had done what all his wealth could not. And that was something priceless. The girl finally looked up at him, her wide eyes shining with tears. She whispered softly that she had only done what anyone would do. But he smiled faintly, shaking his head, telling her that no, not everyone would have done what she did. Many people see danger and stay silent. Many people hide in fear. But she had chosen to act, and that choice had changed everything. That choice had saved lives. Around them the police and security continued their work, documenting the scene, collecting weapons, escorting the captured intruders out of the mansion. But the billionaire focused only on the two figures before him, the maid and her daughter. For in this moment nothing else mattered. He felt a rare surge of emotion. A sense of connection that went beyond wealth, beyond status. It was the simple truth of human courage. A truth that reminded him that sometimes the strongest protectors come from the most unexpected places. He promised the maid that her daughter would be safe, that she would never have to fear again. He promised that he would take care of them, not because they worked for him, but because tonight they had stood with him in danger. Tonight they had become more than servants in his house. They had become part of his survival, part of his story, and he would never let that be forgotten. The girl listened quietly, her small body still trembling, but she felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had never known before, the knowledge that her actions had mattered, that her voice, even though silent and written on a small piece of paper, had been heard by someone powerful, someone important, and that it had changed his fate. It gave her a strength she did not know she had. It gave her a glimpse of who she could become. The billionaire placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his eyes steady as he told her she had done more than most grown men would have dared. And she felt her fear begin to melt into pride, her tears drying as her heart filled with the certainty that she had done the right thing. No matter how terrifying it had been, she had been brave, and bravery had been enough. The night slowly quieted, the flashing lights faded as the last police cars drove away. The security team remained on guard, but the worst was over. The trap had been broken, the danger ended, the house once again belonged to its rightful owner, and in the calm that followed, the truth stood clear, that a billionaire had been saved not by his wealth, not by his guards, but by a servant's daughter with a scrap of paper and the courage to act. As the maid led her daughter away to rest, the billionaire watched them go, his heart heavy with thoughts. He had seen many things in his life, betrayal, greed, power, and loss. But this night had shown him something rarer. The pure bravery of a child who owed him nothing but had risked everything. And he knew in that moment that he would never let her courage be forgotten. For gratitude was not enough, the truth had to be honored. And her act of bravery deserved to change her life forever. The night of danger had ended, but the memory of it did not fade quickly. The mansion stood quiet again, the shattered glass cleaned, the broken dishes swept away, the police gone, the intruders locked behind steel bars. Yet inside the hearts of those who had lived through it, the fear still lingered like smoke after a fire, and it was only slowly replaced by relief, by gratitude, and by something far stronger. The bond that had been born between the billionaire and the maid's daughter. The billionaire spent the rest of the evening in his study, the soft glow of the lamp falling across the papers on his desk. But he could not focus on numbers or business deals. His thoughts returned again and again to the moment the folded note slipped from his napkin. The shaky handwriting, the desperate warning, the courage it had taken for a young girl to risk everything. He leaned back in his chair, realizing that no deal he had ever signed, no empire he had ever built, had been as important as that small piece of paper, for it had saved his life. The maid tucked her daughter into bed in the small room they shared on the mansion's side wing, the girl's body still trembling, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but her heart restless. She whispered to her mother that she had only done what felt right, that she was scared but could not stay silent. The maid kissed her forehead, tears shining in her eyes. She told her daughter she was proud, more proud than words could ever say, and though fear had nearly consumed them, the mother knew that tonight her daughter had proven herself braver than many grown men. The next morning the mansion felt different. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed warmer, softer, as if the house itself had survived something heavy and now welcomed the new day with relief. The staff whispered quietly about the events of the night, about the masked men, about the flashing police lights, but most of all they whispered about the girl, the maid's daughter, who had slipped a note that saved their master's life. The story spread quickly among them, and the once quiet child was now looked at with awe. The billionaire called for the maid and her daughter to meet him in the grand hall, his voice calm but filled with purpose. When they arrived, the girl's hands twisted nervously as she stood before him, her mother's hand resting on her shoulder to steady her. The billionaire looked at them both for a long moment, then spoke words that would change their lives forever. He told them that what had happened the night before was not something small, it was not something he could forget, and it was not something that would go unrewarded. He said the girl had given him more than protection. She had given him a chance to live, and for that he would give her the chance to live a life free from fear, a life filled with opportunity. He promised her education, the best schools, the best teachers. He promised her a future where her sharp eyes and brave heart could grow into something greater, where she could become anything she dreamed of, and he promised the maid that her years of service, her loyalty, and now her daughter's courage, would never again go unnoticed. The maid broke into tears, her body shaking with relief and gratitude. She had never expected such words, never expected such a gift. She had only wanted to raise her daughter in safety, to work quietly, to survive. But now the billionaire was offering her daughter a chance at a life beyond anything she could have imagined. And she whispered through her tears that she would never forget his kindness, just as he had promised never to forget their courage. The girl listened in silence, her wide eyes filled with disbelief. She had never dreamed of schools beyond the ordinary. She had never imagined that her small act of bravery could open such doors. Yet as she looked at the billionaire's steady eyes, she realized he was serious, his promise was real, and her heart swelled with a new feeling, a feeling of strength, of hope, of knowing that her life had changed forever, not because she had been lucky, but because she had chosen to act when it mattered. In the weeks that followed, the house slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the bond between the billionaire and the maid's family grew stronger. He visited the girl often, asking about her studies, encouraging her with kind words, reminding her that courage was not just about saving lives. It was also about facing the world with honesty, with determination, with the will to rise above fear, and she listened closely, each word shaping her, each promise strengthening her belief that she could become someone important, someone strong, someone worthy of the chance she had been given. The city outside continued with its noise, its traffic, its endless business deals, but inside the mansion the story of that night remained alive. A story whispered by staff, a story remembered by guards, a story that reminded everyone that money and power could not always protect a man. But sometimes the smallest, most unexpected voice could, and the billionaire himself carried that truth with him into every meeting, every decision. For he had learned that his greatest fortune was not in gold or contracts, but in the courage of a girl who had nothing yet gave him everything. Years later, the girl would look back on that night with clarity, remembering the fear that had gripped her, the shaking of her hands as she wrote the hurried note, the pounding of her heart as she slipped it into the napkin, and she would remember the way the billionaire looked at her the next morning, his eyes filled with gratitude, his words filled with promise, and she would know that her life had been shaped by that moment. That single choice to act had written a new story for her, a story of hope, of opportunity, of courage. And for the billionaire, the night remained a reminder that even in a world filled with wealth and power, sometimes salvation came from the humblest places, sometimes life was saved not by fortune or force, but by a frightened child with the courage to speak when silence would have been easier, and that truth, more than any treasure, became the lesson he carried for the rest of his life.